Welcome back. This is the fourth class in our study of the Rebbe's monumental Sikha on the topic of the Tekufos in Yemos HaMoshiach, Siman Gimmel and Malchus, as part of the global campaign to learn Malchus. So today we're going to learn from Sifim Yud through Yud Dalet. So where are we right now? By introduction. We've already established a central point of the Rebbe's Sikha, of the Rebbe's Biur in Rambam. The basic question was, how could the Rambam say that when Mashiach comes, the world's going to operate as it always has been, when this seems to be in contradiction to the fact that the Gemara and Teres Kohanim say that when Mashiach comes, Ilonei Srak, trees that are, as of now, do not bear fruit, will begin to bear fruit. And we cannot simply say that this too is mashal v'chida, that this too is a parable, a metaphor, as the Rambam says with regard to other nevuos, because in the context of the Gemara, it's clear that these things are literal. And then we went even further and said, now, if we were to say, like the shit of the Ramban and Chassidus, that Olam Haba, the world to come, referred to in the Gemara, is a time after Mashiach's coming, but a time in which there is still this physical world and there's still physical bodies. In other words, Olam HaTchiyah, the world of the resurrection. And that's Pshat Olam Haba, that's Pshat the world to come. And if that's the case, we can take all the miracles and all of the sources that say that there's going to be an actual change in the nature of the world and say that it's referring to Olam Haba, the world to come, not Yemos HaMoshiach. And Yemos HaMoshiach retains the nature of this world, and it's all mashal v'chida. But considering that the Rambam says Olam Haba is not our world at all, Olam Haba is a world of neshamas without gufim, neshamas without bodies, then whatever changes to nature of our world that are going to happen, including Ilonei Srak, making fruit, tree, bearing fruit, as well as Tchias HaMesim, must therefore happen in the era of Yemos HaMoshiach, because Olam Haba doesn't have the physical element in the Rambam's view. Olam Haba is neshamas b'lo gufim. It's a soul without a body. It's not our world at all. So any description that's literal, any miracle that's literal, must be therefore within Yemos HaMoshiach. And thus the Rebbe says we are compelled and must say that within Yemos HaMoshiach Gufa there are two Tekufos. This is where we left off. And in Yemos HaMoshiach Gufa there's two Tekufos. There's the beginning Tekufa, which Mashiach, the person, ushers in an era of world of halachic perfection within the physical world, no change in nature. And there's a later Tekufa that's still part of the epoch of Yemos HaMoshiach, but isn't yet Olam Haba, the world to come, because in the Rambam's view, Olam Haba is neshamas without gufim, without a physical body, without a physical world really at all. So there's a later Tekufa within Yemos HaMoshiach in which all these miracles happen, including Tchias HaMesim. This is where we left off. Now, before we go further, I want to address two questions, which I think will help us sharpen our understanding of the Chiddush that Rebbe is doing here. Question number one is, in Sif Tes, the Rebbe asked, B'negeya to Tchias HaMesim. The first Shaila in Sif Aleph, which the Rebbe proposed two possible solutions and then rejected them both, was B'negeya to Ilonei Srak, bearing fruit when Mashiach comes. And then in Sif Tes, the Rebbe says, to explain that, first we're going to ask another kasha, which is about Tchias HaMesim. Is not Tchias HaMesim the more obvious question? Why start, if Tchias HaMesim is a question, how could the Rambam say nothing's going to change? Well, of course, there's going to be Tchias HaMesim. If that's a question, why not ask that one to begin with? That's the more obvious question. Why ask about Ilonei Srak? They're like found one Gemara that implies that there's a literal, implies by context that there's a literal miracle of Ilonei Srak. Why not just ask straight from Tchias HaMesim? That seems to be more the obvious question. Right? Question one. And question two is, what did people think before the Rebbe came around with this biur? This seems so obvious. No, it's mukhrach because it's Tchias HaMesim. So you must say that there's another Tekufah in which Tchias HaMesim is going to happen. What did people think before then? Is this not obvious? So I think the two questions answer each other. And this will help us understand the Rebbe's Chiddush here. And this gets back to something we mentioned in the first year. It's going to become the Geya later as we go along in this series. Not in this year, but the next year. It's going to come again. The issue of Tchias HaMesim was already answered by the Rambam, Be'etzem. Because in the Rambam's letter, Igeres Tchias HaMesim, which we learned about in our previous shurim, where people accuse the Rambam of not believing in Tchias HaMesim because he writes that Mashiach doesn't have to be Mechayim Mesim. There he writes, look, in my Sefer Halachas, I am busy describing the halachas of what Mashiach has to do, and those who believe in Mashiach and those who accept Mashiach have to know what his halachic requirements are. And his halachic requirements are not to make Tchias HaMesim. As far as what God's going to do, it's not our business. Tchias HaMesim is God's business, and he will do as he wishes, when he wishes. So what did people think until the Rebbe came around? Very simply, the Rambam is talking about Yemos Mashiach, and everything that happens there is Mashal Echida. Everything is Mashal Echida, including Lo Nisrak and whatever. Everything is Mashal Echida. Like the Radva said on the Ravid's question. The Ravid said, "How could you say it's nothing literal?" It says It said the Radva this is not a question, because it's a Mashal Echida too. So everything was written off, as it were, as a Mashal Echida in the Rambam's view. Tchias HaMesim, Hashem will do it when he wants, if he wants, before, not if he wants. Hashem promises he will, but he'll do it before, he'll do it after, whatever he wants. That's how people understood the Rambam until now. Which is why Tchias HaMesim alone, I don't think, is enough of a question to ask on the Rambam. Because the Rambam addressed it in his letter. And it's not our concern here in Hilchos Malachim. Our concern is what Mashiach has to do. And Tchias HaMesim is what God does. The Rebbe's real question, and which is compelling the Rebbe to say that even the Rambam says that Mashiach will have miracles, is because of this one prophecy in the Gemara, which is implied that it's literal. Because of the context, we must say it means literally. Now, once we're going to say that there's a tekufa in which there's a literal miracle, then you can put Tchias HaMesim there too, and you can put the Ravid Zishpat Chayrav and Haaretz there too. Now, what do you gain by putting Tchias HaMesim in that second tekufa? And this, I think, is what the Rebbe is trying to accomplish in Sif Test that we learned at the end of last year. By putting Tchias HaMesim at the end, in a second tekufa in Yemos Mashiach, what we gain is that all of the Amorei Chazal, which talk about a certain time frame for when Tchias HaMesim is going to happen, now become legit. And as the Rebbe told us in Hara, what was it? The Hara, where is it? Hara 52. I'm looking at the wrong secha here. I think it was Hara. I apologize, I opened up to the wrong secha here. So maybe I have to go a little further. Ha'ara 65 here, where the Rebbe says that when the Gersa Tchias HaMesim says that Hashem is going to make Tchias HaMesim happen whenever he wants, the Rebbe says, and that's really what we gained in Ois Tes. Until the Rebbe came around, we would have looked at Rambam like this. Look, but Hashem will do whatever he wants. Do Tchias HaMesim whenever he wants. Either my mother Razal that give it a certain time frame. Okay, maybe it's speculation. Like the Rambam writes in his letter there. What we're saying is not a hechrich, it's not a hechleti. It could be either way. The Rambam in his Sefer Ayad is talking specifically about what Mashiach has to do. But now that we are compelled because of the Yud of Elon Esrak to say that there's a later Tekufos in Yemos Mashiach and which there's miracles, now what we gained is that all these Mamorei Chazal, which give us a certain time frame for when Tchias HaMesim is going to happen, now become upheld too. So the Rambam Sefer Ayad now becomes Kafter Referach with all the descriptions of Chazal. It goes perfectly, and we don't have to kvetch and say this is a Moshe V'chida. We don't just. It becomes very clear. Everything that's described in Mamor Azal about when Tchias HaMesim can happen is correct. All the orders is correct. But I'm not talking about it here because I'm only talking about the first Tekufa, not the second Tekufa. And that's the Chorda what the Rebbe is accomplishing here with the second Tekufa. Now, what we're left with is explaining, first of all, to see this Chidush of the Rebbe in the Lashon of the Rambam. as well as how it fits in the Shas and the Teres Koyanim. And also at the end, we're going to come to understanding what did the Rambam mean in his letter. If we have a clear order and the Sefer Hayad is not contradicting the orders given in Maimar Razal, then what did the Rambam mean in his letter? And that we're going to get to in the next year. But for now, we're going to look at Sifim Yud through Yudalid. The Rebbe is basically going to explain how this new Chiddush now explains all the Inyanim in the Rambam. So let's see. Oisiyut. Now we understand why at the beginning of Perek Yud Beis, Kaisev, when the Rambam writes, that a person shouldn't think anything in the world is going to change from the order, from the natural order as it is now. He doesn't bring any proof for this fact, as he does in an earlier time, in the earlier Perek. We'll look at the Hara in a second. Well, the Hara just tells us where it is in Perek Yud Aleph Lacha Gimmel. The Lakach. So he doesn't bring a raya here in Perek Yud Beis to the fact that Elam Kam Hagenog, as he does in the previous Ois, the previous Perek, in Perek Yud Aleph, Akach, Shem Mashiach Tzarech Har Shem Ofis Mofis, where there he brings a raya that Mashiach doesn't have to do any miracle to prove his validity. This is the Lashon of the Rambam in Perek Yud Aleph. Earlier we quoted Perek Yud Beis, in the beginning of the Sikha, now we're quoting Perek Yud Aleph. This is the Rambam Lashon in Perek Yud Aleph. Don't think that Mashiach has to do any miracles, and has to renew anything or make any new novel things in the way the world runs, or to revive the dead, or anything like that. This is not the case. What's the raya? We talked about this raya earlier in one of the shiurim. Rabbi Akiva was the greatest of the Chacham of the Mishnah. And he would carry the armory. He would carry the armor. He was the sword bearer of Ben Kaziva, Bar Kochba. HaMelech was king, right? We talked about him. This is within a century after the destruction of the second base Mikdash. There was a number of rebellions trying to overthrow the Romans, and the most successful, the closest to being successful, was the one of Bar Kochba. And Rabbi Akiva followed him. And Rabbi Akiva said that is Mashiach. And everybody, him and all the other Chachamim, believed he was Mashiach. Until he was killed because of his sins. And once he was killed, they knew that he wasn't Mashiach. And the Chacham didn't ask him to prove himself by doing any miracles. It's the Charaya that you believe in Mashiach even without any miracles. Because Rabbi Akiva did about Bar Kochba until the point that he was killed. Footnote 67, which is really going to come up later, so but the Rebbe mentions it now anyway. Now, and therefore, the Rambam negates, based on this halacha, the fact that the Rabbi Akiva followed Bar Kochba without any proof of miracle. Maimar Azal, that which the Gemara says, the Mashiach says about Mashiach that he's going to but it means he's going to judge based on a sense of smell. So the Gemara says that the reason why they actually killed Bar Kochba is because he wasn't able to perform this miracle. But the Rambam is saying that's not the case. But they was killed because of sins. So that will be discussed later. This is a discussion Machlal. The Noisei Kalim, the Mefarshim and the Rambam discussed this exactly with the Rambam's sources for this. And there seems to be conflicting reports even within Chazal about exactly what happened with Bar Kochba and Rabbi Akiva. But upon him, the Rambam is of the opinion that they believed he was Mashiach even without him proving any miracles, and therefore no reason. So this is proof that Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles. Now in Perek Yud Beis, when the Rambam says that the world is not going to change, he does not bring a raya. So why does he bring a raya in Perek Yud Aleph when he says that Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles? Whereas in Perek Yud Beis, where he talks about that the world's not going to change, he doesn't bring any raya that the world's not going to change. Why doesn't he bring a raya? And this is another nuance in the Chiddush of the Rebbe. Till now we understood that Perek Yud Aleph is talking about what Mashiach has to do. And Perek Yud Beis is talking about what the world's going to look like. Which is why I mentioned in one of the earlier shiurim that the big shiloh is on Perek Yud Beis, not Perek Yud Aleph. Because Perek Aleph, when he talks about what Mashiach has to do, that the Rambam kind of addressed in his letter by saying, look, we're talking about what Mashiach has to do, and what God has to do, that's his business. He'll do it when he wants, how he wants. But in Perek Beis, the Rambam doesn't discuss what Mashiach does. He discusses what the world is like, meaning how God's going to run the world. And there he does say that the world's going to continue as is. And therefore there's this data, how come there's no miracles, as we see from Ilan Yisrak and Tches HaMesim. But now that we have two Tekufos, that means there is a time when Mashiach comes that there isn't any miracles, the first Tekufa. And that's what's being described in Perek Beis. And that connects it back to Perek Aleph, as we'll see now. So, even though the two prakim are two separate issues, as we just mentioned, the Perek Aleph is Malchus Mashiach Atzma. And Perek Aleph talks about what Mashiach has to do, what he's going to accomplish, and describing the manner in which he arrives. And Perek Beis doesn't talk about what Mashiach does, but it's matzav ha'olam b'ma'aseh Mashiach, but rather it talks about what the world's going to look like when Mashiach comes. So the raya for Perek Aleph that Mashiach doesn't have to do any miracles is not a good enough raya for Perek Beis, where there it describes what the world looks like. And l'chora, the world is going to have change. There's going to be Tches HaMesim. But now that we see two Tekufos, we can say no. That I have a Perek Beis, that even in Perek Beis we talk about the world's going to be like Medubar, matzav ha'olam, kafish is a kosher in Bias HaMashiach. That Rambam is describing what the world looks like, but the world as it's ushered in by the person Mashiach. So now what we're doing is the Rambam is splitting between what he's saying in Sefer Yad, that he's talking about what Mashiach has to do, and that the other Tches HaMesim and other things, that's what Hashem has to do. Like he writes in the Tches HaMesim. So earlier we said, in one of the previous shurim, we said that this becomes a big problem because Perek Beis talks about what the world has to do. But now that we're saying that there's a split in time, there's two Tekufos in Mashiach. So now we can say that when the Rambam describes in the Geras Tches HaMesim what God's going to do, well, first of all, God can do whatever he wants, and God might do miracles, but primarily it's going to happen in Tekufa Beis. Tekufa Aleph, which we are describing in Hilchos Mashiach, is weiter connected to the halachas of Mashiach. How is it connected to the halachas of Mashiach if we're talking about the state of the world? What does the state of the world have to do with halachas? Answer the Rabbi now saying that the Rambam is describing the state of the world as it is when Mashiach ushers in the world. So even this Perek Beis is shaykh to Mashiach's coming. Mashiach the person, not to God's doing. But what's the matzav ha'olam when Mashiach arrives? In other words, like this. One could have said like this. Mashiach himself doesn't have to do miracles. But when he arrives, God should be doing miracles. And if God doesn't do miracles, then that means it's not the real Mashiach. And so the Rebbe says, no, because it's two Tekufos. And Takachu Hashem is going to do miracles, but that's in a later Tekufa. And the earlier Tekufa, the world does not, God does not have to do miracles at that point. And therefore, the world that the Mashiach ushers in doesn't change, even though later God ushers in a separate era in which there are miracles. So even Perek Beis, which is a description of the world, is a description of the world as it's ushered in by the person Mashiach, prior to God changing the world in the second Tekufa. And therefore, Mela, Haraish, Perek Beis, for the Raya that in Perek Beis, the Gabi Melech HaMashiach, with respect to the person Mashiach, that he doesn't have to do miracles, Koicha Yafa is just as good. All it's equally good to prove the point with respect to Perek Beis. With respect to the state of the world, as it's connected, as it's ushered in by the arrival of the person Mashiach. And amongst them is the world has to be as is. Because if Mashiach's arrival, even if he doesn't have to do miracles, but if the world must be in a state where it's miraculous, and there's some change in creation, and that would mean that this is the inyan of Mashiach, even if it's not something he has to accomplish, but it's something that has to be there when he arrives. Which would mean, therefore, that the arrival of Mashiach, it would mean that the arrival of Mashiach must include within a change in the world, even if he doesn't do it. Mashiach does accomplish miracles, even if he himself is not performing them, but it has to be happening in the world when he's there. And if that's the case, and then that would be part of testing if he's actually Mashiach, to see, did the world change? Did God do the miracles expected now? But now that we understand that there's two Tekufos, and that Hashem's bringing of miracles happens at a later point, and at the beginning stages of Mashiach, when Mashiach himself ushers in that world, nothing changes in the world. Therefore, Because the Rambam proved from Rabbi Kiva supporting Ben Bar Kochba as Mashiach without asking for a miracle. And this is a proof that Mashiach does not have to do any miracles. That means that in the world, when Mashiach comes, there also isn't any change in the world. Because if that's the case, Rabbi Kiva would have asked, where's the world? Where's the miracles in the world? Mainly, he didn't ask Bar Kochba, where are your miracles? Because Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles. But he should have asked the world, or looked around the world, where are the miracles in the world? And the fact that Rabbi Kiva didn't do that means that when Mashiach, the person, arrives, he doesn't have to do miracles, nor does the era he walks into have to have miracles. It's only later that miracles arrive. Hara 68. Now you'll remember from Hara 4, the Rebbe told us to look up that which he wrote in his Hadran and Rambam, in the Lashon of the Rambam, the beginning of Hilchas Deus, al yala al adas, shued in himself, that a person shouldn't think that God doesn't exist, chas v'sholom, because if he doesn't exist, nothing else can exist. And the Rebbe there explained that this yala al adas, this expression yala al adas, which means you shouldn't think, implies an aliyah b'das, that you are having a better idea. What's the better idea? That God doesn't exist, God forbid? But rather, the Rebbe explains there, beautiful, very deep sikha, deep hadron. The Rebbe explains that the person is thinking that God transcends existence. Shahu, that he, God, ein emotzai, is a non-existent existence. He's an existence that transcends existence. And don't think that says the Rambam, even though it's an aliyah b'das, even though it's a higher understanding of God, because we're talking about God's transcendence, Seiv Kalamim. Nonetheless, that can't be that a God is simply transcendent, because otherwise the world can't exist. God must have condensed himself to be a motzai, to be an existence, to be an imminent existence invested in creation in the Malachlam. Okay. Now, if that's the case, Yala Ladas means it's a mistaken idea, but it's a elevation. It's a better way of thinking, even though it's mistaken. Now, if that's the case, in Perek Yud Beis, why did I say Al Yala Lev? L'chura, I just negate in Perek Yud Aleph. I already just told you that the world's not going to change. And Mashiach, the person, walks in, doesn't have to do miracles, which means the world he walks into also doesn't have miracles. So you already know from Perek Yud Aleph that it's a wrong idea to think that there's going to be miracles in the world. So why again use this expression Al Yala Lev, that the world's not going to change? Where's the aliyah? Why would it be a good thing to think that even though Mashiach is doing the miracles, the world has miracles? We just finished saying it's not a good idea. So what's this expression Al Yala Lev? If Al Yala Lev, as we said before, means an aliyah b'das, a higher form of thinking. In other words, there's a higher form of thinking that Mashiach has to do miracles, because it's a beautiful thing if Mashiach has to do miracles. Says that I'm no, but then weiter, now you're making another mistake in Perek Yud Beis, Yala Lev, that the world's going to have miracles. You just finished telling me it's a wrong idea already. This is the Rebbe asks. This is, I think, what the Rebbe's question is, even though he doesn't say his question is based on Ha'ara 4, but I think that's where the question is based on. And the words of the Rebbe, Mash became Maskal the Perek Yud Beis Al Yala Lev Mashiach Hulu. The Rambam again says Al Yala Lev. Hadimedayik, because of the Rambam is precise in his language, and he didn't loy Al Yala Das. He didn't say don't think in your mind. Al Derech Halacha Perek Yud Aleph Sham, and like he said in Perek Yud Aleph, and like he said in Hilchos Deus. But rather, the Rambam said Al Yala Lev. You shouldn't take it to heart. So in Perek Yud Aleph, the mistake is an aliyah b'das, where I think, maybe Mashiach has to do miracles. Good idea. It's not a foolish idea, but you're wrong. In Perek Yud Beis, even though I cognitively understand that Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles, but Yala Lev, it comes into my heart that, you know what, maybe the world fart is going to have miracles. In the Rebbe's words. That you've already established in Perek Yud Aleph, from the Raya, from Bar Kochba, that Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles. So you know cognitively in your das, you know. Kim Av Shebadas, even in his knowledge, as much as he can possibly understand Mashiach, and therefore automatically you know what the world looks like when Mashiach arrives. And then that includes that Mashiach does not control and therefore doesn't change the nature of the world. You know that already from Perek Yud Aleph. But B'cholze, nonetheless, emotionally, you still want there to be miracles. Because of the great love, because of the great yearning he has for the great Yaskel Yoda, for the great, Torah genius and the powerhouse of Mashiach, he's hoping Mashiach's going to have miracles. Never puts in the sources here, Yeshaya, the source of the source of the pasuk. And then he tells us to look in Rambam Cheshuva, and as well as here in Hilchos Malachim, where both of these places the Rambam describes Melech HaMashiach as a great Talmud Chacham, and in Shara Munah from the Murim Tzoi, where he also describes the level of Gilui HaTorah in the Zman HaMashiach, and it's even higher than Moshe Rabbeinu, and in Biyudei Zoyar, where there it describes where exactly in Atzilus the Gilui comes from in the David Avdi. But upon him, because of his emotional attachment to Mashiach's coming, Yala Liboy, he'll think that maybe still the world's going to have miracles. This too the Rambam wants to negate. Now, this is such a beautiful Geshmaka thing. First thing Ha'arafot ever told us, even though the Rambam tells us with good rayas that nothing in the world is going to change when Mashiach comes, it's still not like a foolish thing to think that Mashiach is going to do miracles. It's an aliyah b'das. Wrong, but it's still an aliyah b'das. And then it goes even further here. It says, even after you cognitively know that Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles, and therefore you cognitively know that the world is not going to be in a miraculous state, because he's going to walk into a world that's natural, but still, it's an aliyah. It's a virtuous thing to have an emotional attachment to the desire of Mashiach that you want there to be miracles. And to me, it's Gavaldik. Upon him in the footnote there tells us, even though there is medayik in this lashon of Yalalav. Okay. Oisir Aleph. It's not Pisa, move on. So based on all the above, Perikid Beis, which describes the world, not Mashiach's doing, means everything described in Perikid Beis is not a description of the totality of Mashiach. Because there's a part of Mashiach, the second for which God does miracles, but it's only related to what the world looks like when Mashiach, the person, arrives, which is the beginning. Just in Meres meaning to say, Tchila, first, the Perikid Aleph, in Perikid Aleph Nevar, Rambam, the Rambam explains, Ma'amun Yonesh Mashiach. What is Mashiach's in you? The Mashiach is going to restore the kingdom of David, to the way it was, but Beis should build a mikdash and gather all the Yidden and restore Torah authority, who Yavishnemus the mitzvahs of Hilchos Torah will bring Shlemus in learning Torah, as we learned, Sihar 70, that of course is Siman Aleph of Malchus, which no doubt we all learned here. So that's the first thing that Rambam describes, is what Mashiach himself has to accomplish. Restoring full service of Hashem. With the Beis Hamikdash, Eretz Yisrael, Shemitah, Yovel, Melech, Malchus, Beis David, all of it. That's Perikid Aleph. After Perikid Beis, Koyar Rambam, Kifisha Matzav, Olam, Behesim Lakach. Then he describes how the world is going to be parallel to that which Mashiach accomplished. Kifisha Messiah, as the Rambam concludes the Perikid Beis, that the world, that Yidden are going to be free to learn Torah and wisdom of Hashem. And so on. The occupation of the world will be nothing other than the knowledge of God. And therefore Yidden will be great Chachamim. The Iker, more important, right? Serving Hashem, if the point of Mashiach's coming is that we should be able to serve Hashem properly, this is something we talked about in the last year. The Rambam's view is that Mashiach is just to bring a world to a state of no distraction, no issues in the world, and we serve Hashem properly. Now, the proper way to serve Hashem is not in a state of miracles, but in a world that's normal, in a world that's natural. It's natural without distractions, and that's what Rambam describes in Perikid Beis. That when Mashiach comes, he doesn't do miracles, and the world is such that the accomplishment Mashiach is trying to do, which is to restore proper service of Hashem, the world will be in such a matzav to fully accommodate that, without changing anything in nature. Because that's how you properly serve Hashem, in a world that doesn't change nature. Now let's see Hara 72. Okay, so before we get to this, let's look at all these sources here, so you understand what's going on. So the Gemara in Yemos says like this: this is talking as Avnei Hashoyim, etc. The Nesiim brought the stones for the Choshen and the Ephod. So Tana, we learned Nesiim, that the Nesiim means mamish, literally Nesiim. What's pshat Nesiim Mamish? Because, so says Rashi, Nesiim Mamish, Anonim Hayum, Pasha clouds. The clouds brought these stones. It's a miraculous thing. These stones arrived for the Choshen and the Ephod on clouds. And that's Takad the Tagam Yonas and Ben Azil. Taiches the pasuk there. Banasim Aviu. Bananish Maya Ozlan the Pishon. The clouds of heaven went to a place called Pishon Medallion Metamun and brought from there. Yas Avni Barai Yischela. Yas Avni Ashel Mosa. They brought these special stones. The Shaka Be'efudo Choshna to put in the Ephod in the Choshen. Umachta and Yasin Ba'ampe Midbara. And the clouds dropped them off in the desert. Ozlan Rivane Yisrael, and the leaders of the people went. And then they went to the desert where the clouds dropped off the stones and put them in. Okay, so my Aramaic is not that good. I got that from this Peter Yonason, right? Nesim Mamish v'chein Omer, Nesim v'ruach Geshem, Nami l'fi Pshutai, because Pshutai Shamikra is actual Nesim. This deeper taich is that it's talking about Nesim Mamish means Nesim Mamish means clouds, and therefore the Perishayim combines the two. That the Ananim Halcho the Pishoin, Velokam Misham Mishayim, and Mitzvah B'Chol Hayam, Ishlicho Isam Samach Machnisov and Nesi Yisrael Halcho Nemavim Mishkan. Okay, so that's one taich, that clouds bring the Ananei Kavod. Rabbeinu Achaya actually brings this pshat plus another pshat. So let's look at the end of here. So look at my pointer. It's here. This is Yeshe Pirush. First, the second pshat he brings is the miraculous pshat that Avnei Shoyim v'Shar Dvarim b'derech Nesbal Yisrael Chodeshi Malachas HaMishkan Hashem said Evim Anani HaKavod T'Tech Ola Shemoshe, and they're able to do it. The Zeo Aloshin Nesim missing a yud Miloshin Ma'al Nesim to elevate, right? The clouds brought them. In the first pshat here, he brings the pshat that Rashi brings, which we'll look at right here. Banasim Heviyu, the pasuk is missing the yuds. So Amar Rabbi Maro Nasim is not a Bechnukas Mizbeach, but Tchila, Meleches, HaMishkan Lo is not a Tchila. So when it came to Chanukas Habayis, after the Mishkan is already standing and bringing the Kabbanis, the Nasim were first. When it came to building the Mishkan, the Nasim were last. And the Kach Nasim, this is what the Nasim said to himself. Let the community bring whatever they want, donate whatever they want to the Mishkan. Whatever they're missing, all the Mashlimun will fix up. But the community was so eager to donate to the Beit Mishkan that they covered all the costs. And the pasuk says, "Genug." Moshe ben said, "You brought enough." So Amru Nesim Ma'alin Lasas, and the Nesim said, "What could we bring?" Then they didn't donate anything. He views Avnei Shoyim, so they brought Avnei Shoyim. And therefore, it's not Tchila. If when it came to Chanukas Mizbeach, they were first because they were worried they wouldn't be able to do anything. Now, Lefishin is Atzlum Tchila because they didn't eagerly bring their donation first. They waited for all the Yidden to finish. Next in our Ois Mishmam, so they're missing a yud in the name. Now Nesim ksiv, it's missing the word Nesim is written without the yuds. So you have two pshatim in why it's missing a yud. One is Nasa to elevate because the clouds miraculously brought them over. The other pshat is it means literally the Nesim, but the name yud is missing because they were lazy and didn't bring their nedavis right away. They waited for Yidden to finish, which they shouldn't have. Now it's back to the Sikh. Let's see the first part of the Hara. Lahara Mishneh Perushim Be'inyin Nanesim Hiviyu. Lahara for the two Perushim in Nanesim Hiviyu was literally the Nesim, and the missing yuds in their name is because they delayed bringing their donation until all the Yidden were finished. And the other pshat is that it means miraculously clouds, and then it gives us the sources for all these different Perushim, which we just saw. And then there's a second thing, that grain that falls from the sky. So what's the story here? Let's look up the Gemara Menachos and Rashi and Tosfos there. Gemara says Menachos. Rabbi Zera asks the following question: if grain fell from the sky, from the clouds, what's the halach? So says the Gemara, what's Rabbi Zera's question? If we're talking about carbon mincha, a grain offering, on my life, why not use it? It's grain. Who cares if it came from the sky or the ground? Ella, rather, l'shtei halechem. Rather, Rabbi Zera is asking, can you use it for l'shtei halechem on Shavuos? So what's the halacha? So says and this is the essence of Rabbi Zera's question. So what are the two What's the two sides of the question? The pasuk says in Moshe Seichem Rachmana, the pasuk says that you have to bring grain for the lechem on Shavuos. You have to bring it from your dwelling. What's your dwelling? in Eretz Yisrael. La fuke, to exclude the chutz la'aretz. You can't bring grain from outside of Eretz Yisrael for the shnei alecha. The law that you can't. Aval, but the oven, if it's coming from the clouds, shapidami, it's okay to use it. So that's one way of understanding. When the pasuk says to bring grain from your dwelling, it's coming to exclude bringing grain from outside of Eretz Yisrael. But if the grain came from the cloud, go ahead, use it for the shnei alecha. Or other way of thinking about it is you have to bring the grain from where you live, dafka specifically, and therefore anything that's not anything that's not from the land of Eretz Yisrael where you dwell, you cannot use. Even if it comes from cloud, you cannot use. Namilo, you also can't use it. And there's the study of Shalom Zeda. If grain fell from the sky, can you use it for the shtei alech? One side of the coin is, well, the pasuk clearly says you have to take it from Eretz Yisrael, but when it says that, doesn't mean excluding outside of Israel. But if it came from the clouds in Eretz Yisrael, it's all good. Or when the pasuk says take it from where you dwell, it means literally from where you dwell from the land, not from outside of Eretz Yisrael, and not from the clouds. And there's the study of Rabbi Zeda. And the Gemara asks, does such a thing exist? And the Gemara says, yes, there was a certain Arab person whose whole land got covered in grain that fell from the sky. Right? Plus a parsa. He had 3 parsa wide and a land at a tefach high. A full tefach full of grain fell down from the sky, covering 3 parsa of his land. Okay, so the question is, how did these grains fall from the sky? What are they doing in the sky? What are they doing in the clouds? So two types in how they got there. Rashi says it came down imam matar. It came down together with rain. And when it rained, in the rain came down grain. How did it get there? So it says there, Rashi, kindness. So when rain, comes from the water evaporating on the ocean, and that the ocean, the evaporation, the liquid rises to the heavens, there forms a cloud and drops down rain. So says Rashi, what happened was there was such a strong pull of the ocean's water evaporating to go up to become a cloud. It was such a strong pull that it actually pulled with it a full shipload of grain. And therefore the cloud had grain in it from that ship that it sucked up from the ocean. And then it rained down. So you see, Rashi gives a natural, some sort of, it's a very wild theory that you don't see every day, but it's still a naturalistic explanation. That as the rain ascended, as the evaporation ascended, it dragged with it grain that was in a boat in the ocean. So the grain itself isn't miraculous. But Tosfos rejects this pshat and says, if that's the case, then the grain came from outside of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore you can't use it anyway. What's the difference if it happened to have gone to the clouds in the middle? And he answers, it came down miraculously. So again, we have here 2 different areas in which there's and the Rebbe says, there are others. 2 different areas in which we have 2 ways of understanding how halacha is performed. The Avnei Shoyim, Avnei Meloyim, for the Ephod and the Choshen, did that come miraculously or not? Or number 2, this grain that falls from the clouds, which Rabbi Zeda is suggesting maybe could be used for lechem aponim, did that miraculously get there, or by natural phenomenon? And L'chora, the Rebbe is putting this ha'ara here and telling us to take note of it, because he was saying that the ikr service of Hashem is when there is dafka, natural phenomenon. And it would seem to me that in both cases, Rashi, who's the more pashtus one, actually goes with the natural explanation rather than the miraculous explanation. All to say that the world that Mashiach walks into, if his job is, as we described in Perek Aleph, to restore full service of Hashem and halacha, that world must be a naturalistic world, and therefore comes Perek Beis and says the world is not going to change until later Tekufa, which is not our business in Sefer Hayad, when God will do miracles. Okay. So then it continues. Based on all the above, we will understand. And now the Rebbe is, we already answered the question here, but the Rebbe is now explicitly answering the question. Now we can understand that Rambam's attitude towards all the miracles that seem to imply there's going to be literal change to nature. Anytime the Gemara or Tanakh talks about something that's going to happen, a miracle that's going to happen related to Mashiach, the person, Shuhu Yasa, that he will do, or that even if he doesn't do it, but as a result of his arrival, these miracles are going to be there. The Rambam has to say that is a metaphor. So anytime the pasuk, the context of the pasuk, or the context of the Maimer Chazal, is not talking about what happens in the world whenever God does it, but it talks specifically about the time of the world when Mashiach arrives, upon his arrival, or what he himself has to do. Says the Rambam, that has to be literal. That has to be a mashal. Because when Mashiach arrives, and his job is only to usher in a world that remains completely full of nature, but it's perfected in our service of Hashem. So any psukim or mamar chazal that are related to Mashiach himself, or to the era in which he arrives, must be a mashal and not changing the nature of the world. And that's why he quotes the pasuk Gerizim Keves. And that's why he explains that pasuk. Why? Because that pasuk, because that comes in context of the pasuk which we read earlier. The Yishai is going to be the progeny of Yishai, meaning the line of David. So we're talking about the person Mashiach. And because we're talking about the person Mashiach, which is Chaytim Begezer Yishai, the progeny of the line of Yishai, the father of King of David. So therefore, that must be Moshe Mechita. Must be Moshe Mechita. In other words, if you find the Maimer Chazal, or you find the pasuk, it's not talking about that isn't talking about what Mashiach does or what happens upon his arrival. Then maybe it's literal, because that could be talking about a later Tekufah. But if the pasuk is talking about Mashiach's arrival, or something Mashiach does, then it cannot be literal. It has to be, or if it's literal, it has to be not changing the natural order of the world, because again, that's not Mashiach's job. That's God's job in a later Tekufah. And he says, and not only does he say it's a mashal, and when Mashiach comes, we'll know what the mashal is, but he says what the mashal is going to be. And when it says Gerizim Keves, it means that Yidden will dwell securely with their neighbors. Even though he says, anything else that the Pesukim say about Mashiach is a mashal. He doesn't explain how it's a mashal, what the nimshal is. On the contrary, Messiah says, that when Mashiach comes, we'll know automatically what the mashal was. So why does he even, in other words, Rebbe is asking, why does he even tell us what the nimshal of Gerizim Keves? Why isn't it Geya? Just say, all the miracles, including Gerizim Keves, is a mashal, and when Mashiach comes, what the mashal is. Why does it attach what the mashal of Gerizim Keves is? Why does it attach that? Because his intention here is to explain this pasuk of Gerizim Keves, which comes in the context of Mashiach's arrival, the person Mashiach, where they're talking about Mashiach himself. That anything to do with Mashiach's arrival is directly related to no distractions from Umas Ha'olam. In other words, the Rambam wants us to know that whenever there's a mashal about Mashiach the person, it's always going to be related to the world in a state that doesn't distract us from serving Hashem. Whereas prophecies, Yehudim, that are not about the person Mashiach, but about something Hashem does, well, maybe it's a mashal, maybe it's literal, and if it's literal, it's in a later Tekufah when Hashem does it. But if we're talking about what Mashiach himself, the person, has to do, the mashal is always going to be related to the world being at peace so that we can serve Hashem properly. Which is why he teaches that one. And then goes on to say that when Mashiach comes, we'll know. And then he goes on to say that other prophecies, we'll figure it out when Mashiach comes, we'll know what the mashal is. But there is Hara 74, he says, similarly, anything similar to this, with respect to Mashiach, let be Moisei Mashiach. Not that he says anything that talks about the era of Mashiach. Because things in the era of Mashiach, in the second Tekufah, are miraculous, are natural, are literal. But rather he says anything related to Mashiach, the person, hey Mishalim. Okay. So this is all with respect to Pesukim and Mamar Chazal that are referring to Mashiach, the person, not about the era of Mashiach or Yemois Mashiach. But when it comes to the Pesukim and Mamar Chazal, that aren't explicitly coming in context of the arrival of Mashiach, the person. But they're talking about Stam, prophecies about what's going to happen in the future time. Including that which the pasuk says, where it's just a promise from Hashem as a reward for serving him. Doesn't say anything about Mashiach arrival. It's Hashem's promise. Okay, fine. So Hashem's promise, it could be literal in a later time. And likewise, likewise, the Teres Kainim in the Gemara mentioned before, that fruit that today are barren, will bear fruit Okay, they're literal. But that's not about the Inyan Mashiach. That's the Inyan Yemos Mashiach. That Hashem is going to reward us with these things when He wants to in a later Tekufa. It's within Yemos Mashiach because it's not Elam Haba yet. Elam Haba is a time when there's no physical world, it's souls without bodies. So it's in the Yemos Mashiach, but it's not Bias HaMoshiach. Bias HaMoshiach is the arrival of the world as it is when Mashiach ushers in this new era of serving Hashem properly. That, anything related to that, Mashal V'chida, can't be literal because the world Mashiach ushers in is not miraculous. But when Stam Hashem promises there's going to be miracles in the future, there will be miracles in the future after Mashiach's arrival, still within Yemos Mashiach, a second Tekufa within Yemos Mashiach. Okay, R75. In order to understand this, let's again look at the sources that Rabbi quotes here. Okay. The Gemara in Shabbos, where are we? Here, the Gemara in Shabbos is like this: that the Chachamim were thinking. It talks about the Chachamim Goynes. They suppressed certain books because it was spreading misunderstanding about Hashem. And it says, "Va'afse from Mishlei Bikshu Lignois." They also wanted to suppress the book of Mishlei. It's one of the books of Tanakh. They didn't want to ratify it as part of Tanakh. Why should it because there are psukim in Mishlei that contradict each other. So why did they not, I'm right over here, why did they not suppress it? Amri, they said, Sefer Keheles, when it came to Sefer Keheles, which also seems to have apparent contradictions. Did we not investigate and think deeper about Keheles and see that it's sound logic? So Hachanami, same too with Mishlei. Let's look into Mishlei, let's discover it, and we'll come to conclusions and we'll resolve all the seeming contradictions. So it says the Gemara, what are the apparent contradictions in Mishlei? So he says, see, one pasuk says, Altan ksil kivalto, don't respond to a fool in his foolishness. Another pasuk in Mishlei says, Inoksil kivalto, respond to the fool with his foolishness. So do I respond to the fool with his foolishness or not? Says the Gemara, like Kasha, there's no contradiction. So that's an apparent contradiction, which is a reason to maybe suppress the book because people are going to think it's foolish. So the Gemara, no, we can work at it, come to resolve all the contradictions. And how do we resolve that? By saying, when it comes to the words of Torah, then you do have to respond to the fool. But when it comes to matters of the world, we don't have to respond to the fool. Then the Gemara gives an example of what it means to respond not to ignore a fool when he talks about Milah Da'alma. And then the Gemara says, what does it mean that when it comes to Divrei Torah, you should respond to the fool? So says the Gemara, here's an example. Rabbi Gamliel was once sitting and he said the following: I see the Mashiach, in the future time, Mashiach comes, women are going to give birth in one day. It says they're pregnant and they're giving birth at once or together. It's not mamish literal shot in the pasuk, but that's how we read the pasuk. Says the Gemara, there's a student who laughed at this. Amar, he said, the pasuk says, there's nothing new. What do you mean? All of a sudden, women are going to give birth in one day. Amar Leis, he said, it's nothing new under the sun. I'm going to show you an example of this existing in our world. So Nafek, Rabbi Gamliel went out. He showed him a tanagolas, a chicken, which every day lays an egg. So you see, the idea of giving birth every day is not a new phenomenon, and that's going to be applied to women in the future time. Likewise, trees will eventually produce fruit in one day, unlike now that it takes seasons. It says, it'll bear branches and make fruit. Just like the branch grows every day, will also produce fruit every day. So again, the student laughed at this. Amar, he said, the pasuk says nothing new is going to happen. So what do you mean all of a sudden now trees are going to produce fruit in one day? I'm going to show you an example of how this exists even now, where a fruit is produced every day. Nafik, he went out, he showed him what slaf. Slaf is a complicated fruit. It's often referred to as a caper bush. I think that's the way it's translated nowadays. The Gemara has a whole discussion in Masechet Brachos. Basically, there's different parts of the fruit, different parts of this bush that you can eat. Like you can eat, there's a pea, and there's a fruit, and then there's like a branch and a leaf. There's a few different parts you can eat. And the point is you can always eat it. Not just, most trees, there's only a certain season when it produces the fruit, now you can eat from that tree. But this slaf, you can always eat from it. So this is a dogma, this idea that trees are going to bear fruit every day. And then finally, the Sugya of Rabbi Gamliel Kadarish. Rabbi Gamliel again was sitting and explaining. I see that that Mashiach is going to come and produce ready-made. Yisrael is going to produce. Mashiach comes ready-made delicacies and clothing, ready-made cloth for clothing. It says, "He pisas bar ba'aretz." Pisas comes from the word "ksenes pasen," which is cloth, and bar. Rashi tells us it comes from a similar word to baked goods. And if the pasuk says there's going to be abundance of it, it means it's going to happen very quickly. You'll have cloth and caked goods. So says the Gemara, again, the Talmud laughed at this. He said, nothing new happens. What do you mean all of a sudden the earth is going to produce ready-made delicacies and cloth? So Amalei again, Rabbi Gamliel told the student, come, I'm going to show you a dugma of this that already exists. He showed him mushrooms that produce overnight and they're shaped like cake stuff. And with respect to cloth, ready-made cloth, he showed him the hearts of palm that have like this kind of like wrapper around it. That's kind of like a clothing produced right away. Okay, so all to say that this is an example of, said Rabbi Gamliel, says the Gemara, this is an example of responding to a fool on his level. Rabbi Gamliel is telling him there's going to be major miracles. This guy's laughing at it because the pasuk says nothing's going to change. And he showed him that there already exists a me'ain of all these inyanim, and Mashiach comes is going to be taken to another level. So it says now the Rambam in Perish Mishnayos, which is Zakdom to Perek Chelek, in Zakdom to the last Perek in Sanhedrin. And the Rambam there is Meidach in what's a theme of his. We've already seen this theme many times already. That the Rambam is not two things actually. He's not a big fan of chalking up everything as a miracle. Whenever he can explain things in natural phenomenon, he does. We saw this in his letter to Gesat. Likewise, we also learned this earlier that the Rambam, I don't want to say belittles, but he kind of basically said that physical existence is second rate. The real deal is to transcend. And therefore, the more distant you are from materialism, the better off you are. You climb higher and higher in intellectual understanding and attachment to God. So you finally become like a malach that's completely separated, sikhlim and dalim, complete abstract understanding of Hashem without being attached to a body. He goes on to say that even though Hashem wants us to be in a body, that's why we're here. But nonetheless, the ultimate is to be able to transcend the body and be attached to Hashem in a proper way, which is what Mashiach is. That's what he says here. Right? We're going to restore Malchus based David, and all the people are going to be subject to his rule because he's going to be so powerful and so amazing. And all the prophecies are talking about his success and our success. And nothing in this world is going to change, except that Yidden will be sovereign people. This is a theme we've been seeing already from the Rambam a lot of times. Now, continues the Rambam, and at times of Mashiach there will be Ashirim, wealthy people, and poor people, Giborim, strong people, Chalushim, and weak people, just like we have today. But in those days, it's not true there's still going to be poor and rich people, but it's going to be very, very easy for people to be able to survive. With very little effort, that a person will put in, Adam Yigil will be able to achieve a great amount with very little amount of effort. Which, by the way, in parentheses, is mamish our days. It used to be that a person wanted to make a living, he had to break his back. And today, a person sits by a computer, does another couple of clicks, buys and sells, and all of a sudden he has money and he can buy himself a house, buy himself a thing. Relatively speaking, we put in tiny amounts of effort for way more wealth than in previous generations. They put in much more effort of back-breaking labor, and they barely got a beautiful home that's air-conditioned like we have. So even this description of the Mashiach is literally happening today. A few clicks, you make money. A few clicks, you buy something, and you own a house before you know it. So it's pretty amazing. But anyway, now I'm saying that when Mashiach comes, no change in the natural phenomenon. It's just going to be very, very easy to acquire what we need. And this, this is what the Gemara means when it says that when Mashiach comes, Yisrael is going to produce ready-made goods and ready-made baked goods and ready-made clothing. Why? Because it's an expressionism that people say. When a person finds something that's ready and available, they say, "Plenty matzah pasta for you." The person found baked bread, the tafshel mavushal, he found cooked food, right? He found cooked food. So it's an expression, not that actually it's going to produce literally produce ready baked goods and clothing, but it's an expression to say that everything is available very easily, right? And this is why, and this is why he got angry at a student. But the student who said nothing's going to change, and the teacher is telling him, you missed the point. Of course, nothing's going to change. I'm using an expression to describe how easily it's going to be available. Didn't understand the student, who's legal level of the Gemara describes as laughing at Rabbi Gamliel, the student misunderstood what Rabbi Gamliel said. Is what the Rambam saying, and he thought that Rabbi Gamliel meant literally there's going to be beautiful cakes popping out of the ground. And therefore he answered him on his level because he could not understand metaphor, and therefore he showed him things in this world on his level where things grow very fast, like the mushrooms. But it wasn't true. Because the pasuk where you're talking about responding to a fool in his foolishness, right? So the charaya that it's actually not a real answer. It's just to kind of blow off the student who doesn't understand that this is metaphor. Okay. Now I said that like this. So now let's see how this Rambam plays into the Rebbe's beer now. Now, Mashi Rambam calls it Perish Mishnayos, that which Rambam writes a Perish Mishnayos, and Hedron Baktam Perikot, which we just saw, the Maimer Chazal, that which the Gemara says in Shabbos. I see there, it's Yisrael Shtetzikut Goyz Lugim Milas, the Gamliel said that when Mashiach comes, the earth is going to produce ready-made clothing and produce all kinds of baked goods. HaPirush, the Rambam Taich, the Fish Bnei Adam Oimrim, people say, as expressionism. The person finds something ready-made. We say, oh, look, this person found ready-made bread. Not that he actually found ready-made bread, but that everything he needs, he found very easily. Because when Mashiach comes, we're going to have everything we need very easily. So it's a mushal, it's a metaphor, it's an expressionism. Not that actually they're going to produce cakes. And therefore he goes on, the student didn't understand what Rabbi Gamliel was saying. And the student thought it was literal. And he answered him on his level, showing him things in this world that grow very quickly. But it wasn't the real answer. So now the question is, the Rambam teaches that Rabbi Gamliel's statements are not literal, they're expressionism. Even though going with context, which is a big issue for the Rebbe, right? The whole premise for why the Rebbe is saying that the prophecy about the Elon Yisrael producing fruit is literal because the Gemara's context is literal, right? So look at the context of this Gemara. What happens? Rabbi Gamliel said, okay, you don't believe me that Eretz Yisrael is going to produce quickly? Come outside with me, and I'm going to show you mushrooms that grow very fast. So the fact that he's taking him outside and showing him something literal, implication is literal. Because he's, in other words, what's Rabbi Gamliel responding to? The student says, there's nothing new. Says Rabbi Gamliel, you're right, nothing's new, because this idea of growing things quickly already exists. Now, if that's the conversation, it sounds like it's literal. So why is the Rambam going and saying it's not literal, right? So, and at least from the Gemara right now, you might say, right, so until the Rebbe came along, you would say it's not literal. Finished. The Rambam is being consistent. But since the Rebbe is insisting that when the Gemara in context is speaking literally, the Rambam also takes it literally, like Elon Yisrael, I want to say the same thing here. Now, based on what the Rebbe said now, that the Rambam must say that any prophecies related to Mashiach, the person, and related to the world when Mashiach arrives must be natural, because that's Mashiach's job. Mashiach's job is to restore Torah in the natural world. And only God does miracles in the second Tekufos. Then now we have the answer. Yakos, and he pieces Barbaret, because the Pasuk can tell him that the Gemara quotes to say that there's going to be abundance of clothing and food ba'aretz on the land. Which that Pasuk is where we learned, the Gemara learned, that the earth is going to produce these cakes and clothing, these delicacies and clothing. This continues the pasuk earlier in the same perek, the pasuk in Tehillim is talking about Mashiach himself arrival. And if you're talking about Mashiach himself, we just finished saying that any prophecies related to Mashiach himself or something that's going to happen in the world upon Mashiach's coming must be a natural phenomenon, and therefore, because this is unnatural, it must be a mashal. And that's what the Rambam is compelled, even though the context of the Gemara is literal, because the Rabbi says, "Come, let me show you outside a phenomenon where there already exists things that grow very quickly." So it seems literal, but because the pasuk from which we learned this prophecy is talking about Mashiach himself, the person, and we just conclude that Mashiach himself, the person, anything that he does or anything that comes upon his arrival must be metaphor. Therefore, the Rambam is compelled to say it's metaphor. Now, there is a begillah shara memes b'Shabbos sham lifnei zeh. The same thing's true of the other statements about from Gemara there, that the women are going to give birth right away. What was it? Women are going to give birth right away, and trees to bear fruit in one day. Yeah. So those two, says the Rabbi, even though in all of these cases, Rabbi Gimmel showed him natural phenomenon, which makes it imply like it's literal, because he's showing them literal things in this world. Nonetheless, the Rambam is compelled to say that all those things are not literal, because the psukim quoted there are all talk about what happens upon Mashiach's arrival. And not just a description of what Hashem's going to do. It's actually a description of what the world looks like when Mashiach arrives. And therefore, the Rambam is compelled, his arm is twisted, as it were, to take the Gemara out of its context and say it's a metaphor and say it's expressionism, because the psukim there are all talking about Mashiach, the person's accomplishments, and the world as it is when Mashiach arrives, and that must be natural, as the Rabbi learned. Oisid Gimmel. Now, based on the above, you will understand. Now we can go back to the difference between Teres Kohanim and the Gemara and the Ksubas. So you'll remember that the Rebbe pointed out in previous Shurim, when the Rebbe suggested two explanations for how Ilon Esrak, how the prophecy by Ilon Esrak does not contradict the Rambam. And in both of those solutions, even though the Rebbe rejected the solutions, the Rebbe pointed out specific language and the difference between Teres Kohanim and the Gemara and Ksubas. And here they are. And we said then that those, even if the Rebbe rejects the explanation then, but the diuk that the Rebbe points out in the Gemara and Ksubas and Teres Kohanim still remains true. Namely, the Gemara and Ksubas, those are the two unique features of Gemara and Ksubas. First of all, it talks about Ilon Esrak and Eretz Yisrael. Number two, that they will bear out fruit. Not that it's natural to them, but they will unnaturally bear out fruit. This implies it's not natural to it. It's a unique feature. And Be'eretz Yisrael dafka. So this this is in the first tkufa. She'az, that according to then, according to this opinion of Ksubas, which is obviously not the Rambam's opinion. The Rambam's opinion is that universally nothing changes until the second tkufa. But this opinion in Ksubas says that even in the first tkufa, Eretz Yisrael will unnaturally produce fruit. It will unnaturally, Ilon Esrak, barren trees in Eretz Yisrael will unnaturally produce fruit. That's a unique mandamar. But Teres Kohanim, Teres Kohanim, which doesn't make these qualifiers yitnu, that's going to bear out fruit, and doesn't make this qualifier that's only in Eretz Yisrael. It just says Ilon Esrak, that all barren trees will bear fruit. That this is going to be the natural state of all trees, not yitnu, bear out, but oisim, they'll make fruit, like every other tree makes fruit. So it's going to be natural, number one. And it's going to be an entire world, which means that that's an actual change in nature. So when do change in natures happen? This happens in the second Tekufos Mashiach, when a natural phenomenon begins, unnatural phenomenon begins, miraculous phenomenon begins. This is going to be change and unnatural phenomenon, things that are not natural right now. And therefore, because we're changing the order of nature, there's going to be a new nature in the world. And this is something that Rambam can abide by. Which is interesting that this little seif tells us that the Rambam is actually only taking the view of the Teres Kohanim, I think. I don't think that I'm going to be taking the Gemara and Chassidus, because they've already rejected the idea of splitting between Eretz Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael and out of Eretz Yisrael. No change in nature means no change in nature universally. Moreover, if in Eretz Yisrael there's a change in nature, they have pointed this out, then they should have gone to Rabbi Kiva should have gone to Bar Kochba and say, where are the trees bearing fruit? Right? So it must be that the Gemara and Teres Kohanim are definitely arguing. They are arguing, never pointed that out before, because there's change in Eretz Yisrael versus everywhere in the world, be Yitnu versus Oisem. And therefore, the Rambam is going with Teres Kohanim. Yeah. And therefore, the Teres Kohanim, which describes Lon Yisrak, producing fruit, naturally, which is a complete change in nature, is talking about the second Tekufa, and therefore all the other miracles described in Teres Kohanim, which we looked up in the previous year, also talking about the second Tekufa. Now that Rabbi explicitly answers one of his earlier questions, the question from the Lechem Mishnah. Right? The Lechem Mishnah asked if there's a stira in the Rambam. I was about to say, now we see that there's no stira either. The Rambam writes that nothing, he paskins like Shmuel, which says that this world and Mashiach's time are all the same, other than we have freedom and we have Malchus based we have the sovereignty, where we have no distractions from other nations. And yet, the Rambam paskins that you are not allowed to carry weaponry on Shabbos, because weaponry is gnai, is derogatory. Why is it derogatory? Because when Mashiach comes, it's not going to be useful anymore, which is what the Chachamim said. Whereas Shmuel said, the world's not going to change. So according to Shmuel, you should be allowed to carry weaponry on Shabbos, because it's never going to be in his battle. Even when Mashiach comes, you're still going to have weaponry. So it's a stira. Rambam paskins that nothing's going to change in the world to come, and yet he says you're not allowed to carry weaponry. The fact that you're not allowed to carry weaponry is predicated on the fact that we no longer need it when Mashiach comes. Well, if nothing changes, we still need it, like Shmuel says. But now we have the answer. Because when the Rambam said nothing's going to change and we're still going to need weaponry, this is talking about the first decade, the first era of Mashiach. When Mashiach himself, the person, ushers in this world where we can serve Hashem properly, ushers in this era where we can serve Hashem properly, where the natural world stays as it is, and we're still going to need weaponry. And therefore, it doesn't contradict the fact that and it still means that all the prophecies, which is the other question of the Lechem Mishnah, that all the prophecies are not talking about Olam Haba, but actually Yemos Mashiach. Right? We said, remember from the previous room, we said that if you paskin like Shmuel, that this world and Yemos Mashiach, nothing changes, then where are the prophecies of all the things that the prophets have said? It's in Olam Haba. And if you put the prophecies in Yemos Mashiach, that means you think that the world is going to change. Now we have the answer. You can say both. The world's not going to change in the first kufa, and in the second kufa, but Elam Haba is the shamas al gufim beyond anything that's possibly describable. But all the descriptions of miracles, that's talking about Mashiach. But in the second kufa, Mashiach, and therefore back to the issue of carrying weaponry in Shabbos. Now we answer the other question of the Lechem Mishnah, that a person is not allowed to carry weaponry on Shabbos, and if he does, why? The pasuk which says you're going to make your swords into plowshares, which means we're no longer going to need weaponry. Which is talking about the world in Mashiach's time, which means there is going to be a change in the world. The Rambam says there's going to be a time when you won't need weaponry. Not just a marshal, like the Gemara suggested according to the other opinion. It's a marshal of no, I'm sorry, put that aside. Sorry. But that's not whatever the marshal might be. But it's literally, there's not going to be any use for weaponry. But in the first kufa, there will be use for weaponry. And this is Zeyukuyim, this is the second kufa in Yemos Mashiach, when Taka there's not going to be any weaponry. Because at a later time, Shalagula, even though it's a later time in Yemos Mashiach, but still, because within Yemos Mashiach, before we get to Elam Haba, where there's Neshamas B'loi Gufim, but within Elam Haza, which within Elam Haza / Yemos Mashiach, the end of Elam Haza, Yemos Mashiach in second kufa, there's not going to be any weaponry anymore. That means Kli Zayin is Gnai, is a derogatory thing to wear. It's not jewelry, and therefore no carrying it, even though during the first kufa we'll still need it. Okay, why would we need it in the first kufa? If we just said that in the first kufa of Yemos Mashiach, even in the first kufa, the whole of the first kufa, there is peace. There's no distractions from the world around us. That's the whole point of the first kufa. So why would we need weaponry there? Now the truth is, it's not just a question on the Rambam. It's a question on Shmuel also. Shmuel says, okay, so you might say that the sword is needed to uphold Shibud Malchus, right? But the Rambam says, which means legit you don't need these swords. So even the first kufa you shouldn't need swords, according to the Rambam. Says the Rebbe in Hara 76, why you still need weaponry in the first kufa. But when the first kufa Mashiach, even though there's not going to be any hunger and no war, nonetheless, it doesn't mean there's not going to be any need at all for weaponry. But rather, because the Rambam writes there that there's going to be plenty in this world. That's why therefore there won't be any war and hunger. The war and hunger. The reason why there's no war, says the Rabbi, says the Rabbi, is not because the world's naturally going to change and no one cares for war, but because there's not going to be any need for war, because everybody has what they need. Not because people aren't going to stop caring for war, and therefore there's no reason that they should get rid of their swords. They still have it. It's just technically right now, because there's so much and there's such abundance, we don't have war. Which, by the way, notwithstanding the fact that we see wars all over the world, on a graph of history, we have way less wars than we ever had in the history before. And the reason is simply because Canada and the US aren't going to war because we have everything we need. You have everything you need. What's the point of going to a war? It's only other countries that don't have what they need that start fighting. But when they will have what they need, there's no reason to have wars anymore, which is why we have much less wars today than we had in past history. I'm not a historian, but this is a reality so far as I know. And then there are ads, lahayr. Should note that there is such an inyan in weaponry, even when there is no war. So first of all, says there is no such thing as war b'poil. But the inyan of war still exists. It's just technically people won't need war because they'll have everything they need. But because the teva of war still exists, therefore it's still going to be smart to keep your weaponry, just in case some nation decides to attack the Yidden, will be strong enough to fight them back, which is actually what the Rambam wrote in that Pirush Mishnayos. He writes here that Mashiach will be great, Yosim Melech Shema, and he's going to compel everybody to follow him. Misha Yokamol, everybody's going to start up with this King Mashiach. Yavdu Hashem Mis'alav Yimser Oisa B'Yadai. Hashem will put him down and hand him in his hands, meaning Mashiach will go to war to defend the Jewish people, even after Mashiach's coming. But he's going to win, which means there certainly is going to be the need for weaponry, even if technically there won't be war because everybody's going to have what they need. But should someone decide to start up, we have our weapons and we'll fight them off. Afshir. Number two, Rabbi says, Lahoyer, you should note, this is a pasuk in Shmuel Beis, where this is before, after Shaul dies, this is the beginning of the fight between David's people and Shaul's people. What is it? Shboishes, right? I think that's what it is. In fact, my memory is failing me. But basically, David HaMelech is in Hebron, and it's the beginning of a rift. And Abner's people from Shaul's side and Yoav's people from David's side meet somewhere, and they say, let's have a game. Let's play sword. But with weaponry, cherev swords, but do it in such a way that they're having a good time, just playing. And let's see who's better at weaponry, at swording, sword fighting. And Lepoil, but Lepoil actually was murder. They actually all died, and that started a war. But they were not expecting Milchama, which it says there. And then there tells us to look in Kalim, so we'll look at both of those. So the David says, let them play war with each other, and just a fun kind of game. Let's see who's better at fighting. Not that we actually want them to fight, but there was a fight and they died. All 12, I think it's 12 from each side, who actually they killed each other. They all died and it started a war between David's people and Shaul's people. Okay, then they tells us to look in Masechta Kalim, where this idea of weaponry that's meant for play actually has a halachic ramification. The Gemara says, the Mishnah says in Masechta Kelim Perek Chav Dalet, Shloisha Trisim here, there are three types of shields. Trisa Kafaf, a bent shield. What's that? Says the Bartanura, Trisa Kafaf, Kain Mutsun, it's like those we have here. Shemakif Mis Adam, Shalosh Shachosef, they surround the person on all three sides. So Tomei Midras, it's Tomei for level of tumah called Tumas Midras, which is basically for things that you would sit upon. Why? The Asal Shchiva, says the Bartanura. People use it to rest on it. Okay. Then there is, that's one type of shield. A shield that's bent where people sit on it. Then there is and that which they play in like the gladiators. Or not gladiators. Not gladiators, because that's the death. Here it's just the play. Like the Barbanel says, people come into the field of the king. Each one has a sword. The Torah is cut in ogle, and each have a small little round shield. It's not bent, it's just a straight circle, a disc. The other small is in the left hand, so the right hand sword, left hand the shield. And they practice and learn how to shield themselves from the sword of their fellow. So it's not something that they do to actually kill, but just to play. And this is not Tomei Tumas Midras, but Tomei Mes, because you don't actually rest on it. The other one, the bent one, you rest on it. This one, you don't rest on it. And furthermore, V'titza Saravayin. Then there is the shield of the Arabs. Says the partner again. Tardis Katan B'Yosef, it's a small little shield, Saravayin Oisin, that the Arabians use. The ditza, the simcha, they use it to dance, to make play, to put on shows. And it's of no use at all. And therefore, Torah Maklum, it's Torah, it's not a keli. It's just like a tachshit. So here you see in halacha, there's this idea of kli zayin that are not necessarily from Muhammad. Okay, so at this point, we basically answered all the other questions. The Teres Kohanim, the Gemara in Shabbos, the Rambam Perek Aleph, Perek Beis. We still have to get to, Rabbi's going to delve deeper into the Gemara. We're going to get to the opinions of Chibarav and Shmuel, but and they're going to do a little comparison to the Geras Tchias HaMesim, and all that is going to become much more beautiful as we go along.